Well, welcome everyone, and hope everyone is having a great afternoon. Dr. Tim Powell to speak today. Dr. Powell is the Director of MCAT and Vice President at MedSchool Coach, and he is a graduate of he has double bachelor's degrees in bioengineering and molecular cell biology from the UC Berkeley. And he was also a member of the Phi Beta Kappa and Tau Beta Phi and recipient of the Jeffrey Winter Memorial Prize, the award that's given for top graduating senior neurobiology that has an emphasis in molecular cell biology. Dr. Powell completed a PhD from Harvard University in the Harvard School of Medicine. Dr. Powell is the nationally recognized and a career MCAT mind who has worked with thousands of undergraduates and graduate teaching assistants and MCAT instructors and tutors, first starting out at Princeton Review and starting the MCAT program at MedSchool Coach. He has a track record of students improving their scores and achieving scores that are above 40 on the old exams and above 520 on the final exam. And we're honored that we could have him join us again today, and somebody that I also have the honor of calling a friend. So,
Great. Thank you, Ruben. And it's nice to be here again. Today is the second session out of 4 sessions that I'm going to be presenting on this year, right? So our last session, in case you missed it, you can go to their YouTube channel and check it out. It was focused more broadly on how to be successful in your STEM courses, right? So as a pre-med, you need to make sure you do well in your science courses. So talk about how to be successful in your STEM classes in community college and college. Today, we're going to be talking about timeline, right? So as a pre-med, thinking about your coursework and the MCAT and extracurriculars, how can you plan out your timeline effectively? Tomorrow, we're actually going to have our third presentation in the series, and this one's going to be focused on how can you prepare for the MCAT as a community college student, or perhaps a student who's recently transferred to a 4-year institution. And next month, we're going to have the fourth and final presentation of the series, which is really focused on the MCAT exam itself. All right, so let's go ahead and jump in. So Jubin already introduced myself, right? So my name is Ken. I'm the director of MCAT for MedSchool Coach. I completed my undergraduate studies at UC Berkeley. I completed my PhD in neuroscience at Harvard, and I have been teaching the MCAT to students for about 12 years now, right? So quite a while. The first 5 years with the Princeton Review, the past 7 years at MedSchool Coach, where I actually started the program for the company. And I'm really happy to be here, right? Speaking with all of you. Hope that I can provide some helpful information to each of you as you progress towards the MCAT. All right, here's the plan for today. We're going to start off by talking a bit about the pre-med journey and how your coursework in MCAT fits into that. From there, we're going to talk more specifics on how to plan out your pre-med coursework. Then we'll talk about MCAT preparation. And finally, we'll talk about adjusting your timeline for success. All right. So in terms of your pre-med journey, a lot of this you've certainly heard about before, right? Which is if you want to be successful as a pre-med, there's broadly speaking two things you need to do well, right? Which is you need to do well in your courses and you need to participate in various extracurricular activities, right? Volunteer, research, clinical, leadership, right? All of those counts as extracurricular activities. And coursework, you certainly know about general chemistry, organic chemistry, physics, biology, biochemistry, psychology, sociology, math, reading, all of that, right? So I'm not saying that it's simple because there's only 2 things, right? Because for each of these things, there's really quite a lot that you need to do, right? But the sooner you familiarize yourself with all of these different requirements to be successful as a pre-medical student applying to medical school, the greater your chances of succeeding. And an important reason why is because as a pre-med, you only have so many years to prepare your application for medical school, right? If, for example, you want to apply as a traditional applicant, that means you need to apply to medical school the summer after your junior year. So that way you're applying and interviewing in your senior year and you matriculate into medical school right after graduating college. In that case, you've only got 3 years of time to build your application. So all of the courses you need to complete, the MCAT exam, and all of the different extracurricular activities, you have to really squeeze that in a 3 year time frame, right? And that it's for traditional applicants. If you're non-traditional, which means you're taking at least one gap year, it's more flexible, right? If you're taking one gap year, you've got 4 years to plan out your application instead of three. If you're taking two gap years, you've got 5 years to plan out your application instead of three. However, one thing I'll say is that for some students, they plan out their gap years ahead of time, right? Which is they know they want to take gap years because they want to strengthen their application. There's actually quite a lot of students who end up taking unintentional gap years, right? Unintentional gap years as they realize, oh, I'm in my junior year of college. I'm actually not ready to apply to medical school. I don't have enough physician shadowing experience. I haven't joined a lab yet. I don't have research experience. I probably need another year or two before I'm ready to take the MCAT and apply to medical school, right? So many of these cases, it's unintentional gap years because of lack of planning, right? So right now, as you're paying attention to what I'm talking about, you can start to think about the next few years of your life as a pre-med and how you can plan accordingly. So that way, ideally, you don't have to take additional gap years because you didn't plan well. So how do you do this? Well, you need to think about your long-term goals, right? Your long-term goal, of course, is to become a physician, but that is very far away, right? Medical school is 4 years. Residency can be 3 years to, 7+ years and fellowship and such, right? So for many of you, becoming a physician might be more than a decade away, but that's not what I mean by your long-term goals. I mean, your long-term goals as a pre-med, which that really starts with when do you want to apply to medical school, right? And I would say for most people who are starting out in community college or a 4 year institution, most of them don't start off by thinking, oh, I want to become a doctor after I graduate college. I'm going to take 2 years off before I apply to medical school. That's not what most students are thinking, right? Because most students, they want to be a pre-med and get into medical school as soon as possible. So again, many students end up taking gap years just because they didn't plan well, right? So you really want to start with that in mind. When do you want to apply to medical school? And once you know when you want to apply to medical school, you now know how many years you have to prepare everything you need in your application, right? So if you know, hey, I've got 3 more years before I apply, now you need to start thinking about the MCAT exam. When are you going to take the MCAT? And the latest you want to take the MCAT is the spring before that summer you apply to medical school, right? So you apply in the summer, you want to take the MCAT by that spring. If you want to take the MCAT that spring, then you have to think, will I have taken all of the prerequisite courses for the MCAT by that spring? General chemistry, organic chemistry, physics, biology, biochemistry, psychology, sociology, right? And then that's the next step, thinking about your coursework, right? Planning out your fall semester and your spring semester of your freshman year, the fall semester, the spring semester of your sophomore year, the fall semester, the spring semester of your junior year. Will you be able to take all of the classes in time for when you want to take the MCAT exam, right? And for a lot of students, they don't do that thinking. They're often just thinking one semester at a time, right? What classes am I taking now? What classes am I going to take next semester, right? Well, what you really should be doing is planning out your coursework over all of those years. So, okay, this fall I'm going to take general chemistry and biology. In the spring, I'm going to take organic chemistry and physics. Next fall, I'm going to take the second half of physics and biochemistry, right? This is the kind of planning that's important to make sure that you're able to apply to medical school when you want. Also, at the same time, you need to be thinking about all of your extracurricular activities, right? When are you going to uh, join a campus organization? When are you going to run for an officer or leadership position in that organization? When are you going to join a lab to get research experience? When are you going to get clinical experience? And when are you going to uh, get volunteer experience, right? Again, for a lot of students who don't plan well, they sometimes realize, oh, hey, I want to apply to medical school in the next few months, but I don't have any physician shadowing experience. You don't want to try to cram all the experience in a short period of time just to apply because number one, it's very tough to do that, right? You can't just be like, oh, it's currently February. I want to apply to medical school in May. Let me just squeeze in research in March and April, right? A lot of experiences don't work like that. Also, medical schools can often tell, right? Is this someone who actually has an interest in volunteerism? Is this a person who has adequate clinical experience? Or is this someone who's just trying to check off a box, right? So you might have heard sometimes with extracurricular activities, something that's important is longevity, right? It's good for you to join a research lab in your freshman year and then stay in that lab for 2 to 3 years, right? To show that you have multiple years of research experience, right? It doesn't have to be research, right? Like maybe you join a volunteer organization and you're in that volunteer organization for all 4 years of college, first as a member, then as an officer, and then eventually as the VP or president of that organization, right? That longevity is important to make that experience more impactful on your application, but it's also important because it shows initiative, right? You're starting this early on as a pre-med student. You're not waiting until you're about to graduate before you start participating in those extracurricular activities. All right, so all that important in terms of planning out your timeline. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about um, building this timeline because when it comes to timeline, a lot of this honestly just comes down to organization. All right. I'll say for a lot of students, certainly, when you're young, if you're in elementary school, there's no such thing as a schedule, right? Many of you maybe even got through middle school and high school without a schedule, without a planner, and you kind of just kept everything in your brain. Well, that only works for so many years, right? Once you get to college, once you start to take on multiple obligations, it's going to become too difficult to keep everything in your brain, right? When is my lab report due, right? When is my next midterm exam? When is my club meeting? When do I need to go to lab to do experiments? When do I need to go office hours, right? So at some point, you need to figure out how to be organized. And for some people, that might be getting a physical planner and carrying that planner with you everywhere, and writing down, oh, this is my next assignment, right? For other people, and for many people, it's more of a digital version, right? Use a Google Calendar, use the calendar in your mobile devices, right? You need some way to be able to track your activities and deadlines and assignments. And for many students that have figured this out, you already know, okay, hey, this is the start of the spring semester. Once I get the syllabi from all my courses, I'm going to immediately map out the dates for all of my midterm and final exams, right? That way I know when to expect those exams. And it's not like, oh, shoot, my exam's tomorrow. I better start studying, right? You can see in your calendar, you've got an exam in a week. You should start studying this weekend so you're prepared and you don't have to cram, right? And a lot of this seems kind of trivial, but I would say I've worked with so many students these days, and for so many students, it's this organization aspect that really prevents them from using their time effectively. It also leads to anxiety and stress because they don't know what they're doing with their life, right? So at some point, you want to make sure you get organized and you set deadlines for yourself and you also set milestones for yourself, right? When you're studying for an exam, it's not just studying for the exam, right? You might say, oh, hey, the midterm for my physics class is in 2 weeks. There are 12 lectures that are covered in that physics class. You might say, okay, this weekend, I'm going to review the first 4 lectures. Next week, I'm going to review the next 4 lectures. And then the week before my exam, I'm going to review the last 4 lectures, right? Everything is planned out so that way you're organized, right? You're meeting your milestones and you're able to follow the timeline that you build. All right. Now, for the pre-med courses, I listed a lot of courses earlier. The important thing is make sure you figure out how the system works at your school, right? It varies with each school where some classes are only offered in certain semesters. And that sometimes causes students problems because they don't realize, oh, at my university, biochemistry is only offered in the spring. I didn't take biochemistry in the spring of my sophomore year. Now I can't take it until the spring of my sophomore year, right? So many of these courses, there's a sequence you have to follow, right? You have to take general chemistry before you can take organic chemistry. You have to take organic chemistry before you can take biochemistry, right? And each school has their own requirements of what are the prerequisite courses you have to take before you can take a particular class, right? And much of this you can find out pretty easy because at most universities, you're going to have some kind of advisor for your department, right? So let's say you're in the biology department of your university, there should be a biology advisor, right? You can meet with that advisor and you can have them help you plan out all 4 years of your coursework, right? This way you can make sure the classes you want to take before you take the MCAT, you're able to take them. Also, you're able to stagger the courses such that you don't have any semester that's particularly difficult, right? Um, if I haven't mentioned this before, you should know, generally speaking, you should try not to take more than 2 hard science classes at a time. All right. So that would mean maybe the spring you're taking biology with physics. That's perfectly reasonable, right? What you don't want is this spring you're taking biology, organic chemistry, and physics, and you also have lab for all 3 classes, right? When you have a semester where you're taking 3 hard classes, it makes it really hard for you to maintain a high GPA because remember, you're not just a student who's taking classes, you've also got all the other extracurricular activities that you're working. All right. And one other note, yes, you don't want to take more than 2 hard science classes a semester, but that also means you can't just take 2 classes a semester, right? So you're going to have to take additional courses, right? You can think of these as elective courses. Some of them you're probably required to take, right? In order to graduate, there's probably some humanities courses, reading or writing classes that you have to take. But for most universities, you're going to get to the point where you do have some flexibility, right? As in, you've completed all of the requirements for your major, or you're going to be able to complete them on time without any issues, but you still have some free space in your schedule that you can take an additional class or two, right? So just some advice here, right? Which is for the classes that you wanted that you have flexibility, there's several options, right? The first, of course, is it's college. Pick the classes that interest you, right? If you decide, for example, I'm really interested in language, let me take a class on German, right? Or let me take a class on French, right? That's one path. You can take whatever class you want. If you want to take an art class, a theater class, an exercise class, you can do that, right? But the thing you'll note is that many of these are more of hobby classes, right? They're not meant to be difficult. Uh, they're just something that you're interested in. Another option is take classes to boost your GPA. This is actually a really good option for students who are later in their years as a pre-med, right? If you're junior or senior and your GPA isn't as high as you want, this is when you want to take as many GPA boosting classes as possible, right? And every university has these classes, right? You know, the pre-med courses, general chemistry, organic chemistry, physics, and biology, many of those classes are often really hard. People often call them the pre-med weeder classes, right? Because many students can't get a good grade in those classes because only 30% of the students can get an A, another 30% get Bs, another 25% get Cs, and the rest get Ds or they fail, right? That's true for many of the tough pre-med weeder classes where getting an A is honestly tough, right? And not everyone can get an A. However, there's some other classes that aren't like that, right? I remember in college, there were classes that the pre-med students on campus all would talk about. They're like, oh, you should take this class because 90% of the students in the class get an A and 10% of the students get an A minus, right? That's an example of a class that you would want to take to boost your GPA, right? And often many of those classes might be on random topics that, maybe you don't know too much about, right? Maybe it's about music and culture. Maybe it's a class about insect physiology, right? There's a lot of these classes that can be sort of random, but you're taking them because they're easy classes to get an A in to help raise your GPA. The third option that you might decide on for selecting your elective courses are courses that encourage critical thinking, right? I would say um, there's different ways they can approach this, right? For some of these, they could be graduate level courses. For example, if you're a student who's really interested in research, right? Let's say you want to apply to MD, PhD programs instead of just MD programs, you might take a graduate course for graduate students, right? Then you can learn more about how research works, right? And in those classes, you'll learn things that you won't learn in your undergraduate courses. So it's still going to benefit you in your career towards becoming a physician. All right. So hopefully that gives you some sense of courses, how you want to plan them out ahead of time, and also if you have free slots in your schedule, how you can fill in those schedules, those free slots with classes. All right. Next, balancing coursework and extracurricular activities. I said earlier, you want to try not to take more than two hard science courses in one semester, right? One reason for that is because if you take more than two hard science courses in a semester, it makes it more difficult for you to maintain a high GPA. The second reason is that it gives you less time to work on your extracurricular activities. All right. And I would say the mistake that students often make is they want to pick up a second major. Right. So I'll speak to a student and they're like, oh, yeah, I'm majoring in biology, but I also want to major in economics. And I ask them, why do you want a second major in economics? And they'll often say, oh, I just find economics really interesting, right? And yeah, that's great. I'm glad you're interested in economics, but the thing is, the amount of extra classes you have to take to get that economics double major really does not enhance your application by much, right? It just means you're spending more time in your classes and less time on strengthening your extracurricular activities, right? And in fact, if you take more classes, it can make it harder for you to maintain a high GPA, right? So don't think that, oh, if I'm only a biology major, that's too easy. They're going to look down at my 4.0 GPA as a biology major. Well, if you are a biology, economics, public health triple major with a 3.0 GPA, all they're going to see is a 3.0 GPA, right?
The other thing is, I was going to add too, this is a myth that people hear, and I've actually heard some counselors say this to students, to take, um, a lot of classes for the medical school that you handle a challenging curriculum. So like taking bio, chem, physics, calculus, psychology, and then working 20 hours a week, and also, being responsible for your siblings, and also being the president of your fraternity, your sorority, and also, volunteering and also doing research. Like all that stuff is 168 hours in a week. And for you to do all of these extra things, the only thing that you could prove to the rest schools is that you don't know how to balance that schedule, because in 168 hours, unless you're brilliant, um, it's really hard. And Dr. Tao, he was a double major at Berkeley, but he's incredibly fulfilled academically when he went into Berkeley, and he has a knack for studying. And so he could talk about his experience, how he's able to do it. But it's just really hard for people to do that at a very high level and don't get caught up in the coaching of having to prove anything. So, you need to do the best in what you can versus living somebody else's life.
Absolutely. All right. So again, your strategy should be don't take more than two hard science classes in one semester, right? Take those two classes, have some filler classes to help boost your GPA or just classes that you're interested in. Then with your remaining time, you can focus on building your extracurricular activities, right? And there's a lot. Some the continuity is important, right? Like I said, it's nice in your freshman year to join a club, then in your sophomore year to take on an officer position, then in your junior year to take on a higher position, and so forth, right? But that growth is not just in campus organizations, it's really in any area you can think of, right? For example, you might start volunteering at a hospital, right? You're getting volunteer experience. Well, if you volunteer there for a year, maybe the next year you get a promotion to volunteer coordinator, and now you're training new volunteers at the hospital, right? So now it's not just volunteer experience, it's also leadership experience. And same thing, if you work in a lab, the first year, you might just be helping with simple experiments, doing whatever the graduate student or postdoc tells you to do. But in your second year, maybe you get assigned your own project. Maybe in your third year, you get to present your work at a conference. Maybe in your fourth year, you get a publication, right? These are things that require time. As I said, you can't just do research in 2 months, right? So if you're able to take a reasonable course load, you will have more time for your extracurricular activities. I'll mention one other thing, which is if there are students who can double major in 4 years, it's because you don't actually need 4 years to graduate from college, right? There's plenty of students who graduate with a single major in 3 years, right? And that's actually fine too, right? A lot of people are trying to save college tuition by graduating in 3 years, and that's fine. And if anything, there's kind of a nice thing because you graduate a year early, you can use that fourth year, right? That you would have been in college and use that year to work full time in a clinical position or in a lab, right? And in the amount of time that you have in a full year working full time, you'll be able to gain way more experience than you can working part time as a student, right? So that's another option, right? If you're someone who really wants to take a lot of classes, don't just take more classes so you can double major. Take more classes, graduate a year early, save money on tuition, work full time, get more experience. All right. Um, on the note of research opportunities, I just want to talk about this a little bit more, just because my focus is the MCAT exam. All right. As I said before, research is good because you need it for your application. All right. If you do well, you can present your work at a conference, possibly get published, get a letter of recommendation from the principal investigator, right, from the professor of the lab. All of this is good, but another important aspect about research is that it actually helps you with your MCAT preparation. You might not be aware of this, but the MCAT is an exam that you have to take if you want to become a medical doctor, right? And an MD or a DO physician, right? But the MCAT isn't written by medical doctors. The MCAT is written by PhDs like myself, right? And PhDs are really focused on research, not on treating physicians. But because the MCAT is written by PhDs, it just shows you how if you get more research experience, you'll have a better understanding of the passages questions that show up on the exam. So something to consider with research. It can help a lot of students when it comes to the MCAT exam. All right. So now let's
Make,
talk a little bit.
Making a
Go ahead,
plug
Kevin.
on the 7th of March, the Dean of Admissions in Irvine is actually going to talk about this whole research topic in EdNav, so you should come to it.
Sounds like an
And you,
excellent
not you,
workshop.
Dr. Pat.
All right, let's talk a little bit more about the MCAT. Today is going to be more surface level, right? Because tomorrow we're going to talk more about how to prepare for the MCAT as a community college student or a transfer student. And next month, we're going to dive into great detail with the exam. But of course, there's a few important things when it comes to studying for the MCAT, right? And it starts off with having a structured study plan. I already said earlier, organization is key, right? If you cannot get organized as a pre-med student, you're going to run into a bunch of issues, right? That organization with MCAT prep means building a study plan, right? And that study plan isn't just like, oh, these are the things I'm going to do to prepare for the exam. It means building out a detailed calendar of, hey, for every week that I'm studying for the MCAT, what should I be doing? What books should I be reading? Which chapters should I be reviewing? Which practice questions should I be completing? Which practice exams should I be taking? On which days should I be reviewing flashcards, reviewing practice questions, right? All of this should be built out in a study plan. And this just makes sure that by the time you take the MCAT, you've completed everything that you need to in order to succeed on the exam, right? So for some of these things, it's making sure you take enough practice exams, right? Sometimes I speak to students and they're like, oh yeah, I just didn't really have enough time to study. So I just took two practice exams before I took the MCAT. And I ask these students, well, if you weren't prepared for the MCAT, why did you take the MCAT? Right. And they're just like, well, I don't know. Well, that you don't want to be that student, right? If you're not prepared for the MCAT, you shouldn't take the MCAT. And one of the most common reasons why students aren't prepared for the MCAT is because they don't create a study plan. So if you create a study plan and you say, all right, before I take the MCAT, I want to make sure I take at least 8 full-length MCAT practice exams. Well, great. You map it out on your calendar. Uh, the 8 weeks leading up to your MCAT exam, every Saturday, you're going to take a full-length practice exam, right? And not just to start, right? You might say, you know, on Mondays and Wednesdays, I'm going to do a full section's worth of practice. And uh, on the other days, I'm going to review MCAT flashcards, or I'm going to watch videos to review the science content. All right. All of this needs to be planned out ahead of time in a study plan. And some of this also includes building study guides, right? Making study guides itself is a good learning exercise and is also helpful for yourself later on. But again, if you don't have a study plan, if you don't build out time in your study plan to create study guides, number one, you won't have any study guides to use. And number two, you won't have any time to review those study guides. So everything ultimately boils down to effective study plans. And resources, I'll go over this more in subsequent sessions, but I will say these days the internet's incredibly powerful. Artificial intelligence is incredibly powerful, right? So more and more students are turning towards online resources to prepare for the MCAT exam. All right. Next, timing the MCAT exam. I said this earlier, but you need to think about when you wanted to apply to medical school. If your plan was to apply to medical school this summer, like I said before, then you needed to take the MCAT this spring, if not earlier, right? So you want to think about when you want to take the MCAT exam, but you also need to think carefully. If you wanted to take the MCAT in April of this year, how is your spring semester? Do you have a really busy spring semester? Are you studying abroad? Do you have a senior thesis that you have to write this semester? Maybe that doesn't work very well in terms of your schedule, right? And this all goes back to planning. Generally, for students, when they're going to take the MCAT, they're going to make sure the months before their MCAT test date, it's a lighter schedule, right? So a lot of students, instead of taking 16 to 18 units, they might say, all right, this semester I'm going to take it easy. I'm just only going to take the minimum 13 units that's required of my university. I'm also going to tell the postdoc in my lab, I can't come into the lab 3 times a week, right? This semester I can only come into the lab 1 time a week, right? Again, you plan this out to make sure the month leading up to your MCAT, you actually have time to study for the MCAT exam. And again, this is another situation where I run into so many students who don't plan well, right? And what happens to those students? They end up having to push back their MCAT. And if they have to push back their MCAT, they have to push back when they're going to apply to medical school. Instead of applying this summer, they have to apply next summer. And that goes back to what I said in the beginning of today about unintentional gap years, right? For many students, they don't plan well and they find that they need more time. Now, I'm not saying that that's necessarily a bad thing, right? Like there's sometimes students who plan well, but things come up, right? And that's something we're going to talk about as well, which is um, you can plan, but you can't expect your plan to work out perfectly, right? So you might be studying for the MCAT and you thought you gave yourself enough time to study for the MCAT, but you're taking practice exams and realizing, hey, I'm not at my target score. I need a few more months to study. That's okay, right? You figured that out ahead of time, and then you push back your test date, give yourself more time to study until you're ready to take the exam. All right. Now, on this note of adjusting your timeline for success, I tell this to all the students that I work with. Life happens, right? You never know what's going to happen. And there's all kinds of things, right? Sometimes there's unfortunate life events. You might have a family member pass away. You might break up with your significant other. You might fail one of your exams and have to spend a bunch of time really learning that material well so you don't fail that exam. Or you're having some kind of financial difficulties and you have to pick up an extra job and you're working a lot of hours, right? Or you get sick, right? You get sick and you lose 2 weeks just because you couldn't do anything while you're sick, right? There's so many things that can come up, right? And you cannot prevent this from happening. You also can't just say like, oh, well, I got sick for 2 weeks. There goes my dream of becoming a physician, right? That's not how things work, right? Life happens. It's okay, right? You just have to be able to adjust your timeline, right? And some of this you can try to plan for. Anytime I work with a student, um, if I create a study plan and I say, okay, you can be ready for the MCAT in 16 weeks, I'll budget 20 weeks, right? And I'll just tell them like, hey, you could be ready to take the exam in 16 weeks, but let's just give you 20 weeks to study. Why would I give them an extra 4 weeks? Was for that exact thing that I was just saying, which is life happens, right? Now, if you scheduled your exam for 16 weeks from today, if life happens, now you're in trouble, right? Because now you don't have enough time to do everything you need to do on your study plan by your test day. Whereas if you plan some buffer room in your schedule, right? If you say, all right, I know I only have 16 weeks of studying to do, I'm going to give myself 20 weeks. That way, if something comes up and I lose 2 weeks, I'm still fine, right? And changing your plans sometimes is more than 2 weeks. Like I said, for some people, it's realizing I'm not ready to apply to medical school this year. I need an additional year to work on my application. That's perfectly fine, right? But again, ideally it should not be that, this happened because I didn't have a plan in the first place, right? It should be, hey, I came up with a plan. This was my strategy for being ready to apply to medical school. Unfortunately, some things came up, or some things were more difficult than I expected, or some things took more time than I expected. That's why I need another year. That's okay, right? It's okay to adjust your plans. You're still going to become a physician, um, but you always want to make sure you plan accordingly so that way you can eventually get to your goal. Now, in terms of handling the unexpected, I said for some of this, you can be proactive, right? The example I gave earlier of giving yourself 20 weeks to study for an exam when you only need 16 weeks, that's an example of being proactive, right? You're proactively giving yourself more time to study, right? The other thing that's important is um, overcoming the challenges, right? You're definitely going to face the challenges of pre-med at some point or another. And in some ways, that's a good thing because one of the most common secondary essays in medical school is describe a time when you encountered a challenge. How did you deal with that situation? Right. And if you never dealt with a challenge in your life, then what are you going to write about? Right. And your challenges is also a way for you to grow, right? If you take a class and you don't get the grade you want, right? Like you wanted an A, you got a B minus. Well, you have to think, why did I get that B minus, right? What did I do wrong? And how can I become a better student? How can I learn to study better for these classes, right? You learn from those challenges and then you push on forward, right? You take on more classes in the next semester, the next quarter, you get those A's, you get those grades that you want, and you overcome those challenges, right? So those are really the main points that I wanted to make today, just about, this general planning of your coursework and your trajectory as a pre-medical student. And of course, I will be happy to take questions at this point.
This is a question a lot of people get asked is should they have physics and um, physics and also um, biochem lab. Should they wait to take the classes or should they take the MCAT? Should they study them, put on the MCAT and begin studying the paralegals?
That is a good question and indeed a common question, right? So I said earlier, there's a lot of classes that you need to take that's because they're tested on the MCAT, right? And often, most students are taking the MCAT in their junior or senior year. And sometimes you're at the point where, hey, I want to take the MCAT in May, but the thing is, I won't actually be able to take biochemistry until next fall, right? And that's okay, right? If you're not able to take biochemistry before you take the MCAT, if it's just one semester of a class, you can make it work, right? Now, obviously, you're going to have to study biochemistry harder than other students because for other students, they've taken the class and their MCAT preparation is really just reviewing the science content they've learned before. Whereas for yourself, since you haven't taken that class before, you really have to learn the information for the first time. All right. So to me, I would say if you're missing a semester of a class, if you're missing physics two, if you're missing biochemistry, it's not ideal, but you can make it work. If you're missing multiple classes, right? If you haven't taken physics two, if you haven't taken biochemistry, if you haven't taken uh, psychology, right? If it's getting to the point where you're missing multiple classes, then that's when I'd probably wait. But if it's one class, that's usually fine. All right, so let me look at this Q&A. I see we have 8 questions so far. If you have more questions, feel free to submit them. The question is, should you take any electives if you're doing a postbac? So that's a bit of a unique question, right? Because if you're in a post-bac program, you're different than an undergraduate student, right? A post-bac is essentially an extension of your undergraduate studies. I would say the first thing is it depends on the post-bac program that you're in, right? If you're in a DIY post-bac, which means you're just signing up for those classes yourself, I don't know if you necessarily need to do that, right? Because many students, if they're signing up for elective courses, it's because to be a full-time student, they need to take at least 13 units a semester, right? So biology and physics are 4 units each. That's 8 units. They need another 5 units, right? If you're a post-bac, you've probably already taken plenty of elective courses as an undergraduate student, right? And if you're a post-bac, you're either a career changer, right? So you need to make sure you do well in those post-bac courses, or you're doing a post-bac for GPA repair, which is the same thing. You really want to make sure that you do well in those courses. So I would say as a post-bac, elective courses are probably less important. I'd probably make sure you get good grades. Also, make sure you get a really good MCAT score. So that way, medical schools don't have any concerns about your academic abilities. All right. Do you have any advice for finding research opportunities as a first gen non-traditional student? So, getting a research experience, uh, it's not necessarily that hard. In many cases, it's a lot of work, right? The hard aspect is, do you live in a location with labs, right? Because if you live in a rural area in the middle of nowhere and there's no research institutions around you, it's a little tough, right? But I would say, most students that are pre-meds, there's probably a university in your city, and many of them are research institutions, right? If you're in California, pretty much every city has a research institution, right? So, um, if you want research experience, the best approach is to send cold emails to professors, right? Simply go to the websites for that university, right? Like for myself, I went to UC Berkeley, right? So if you go to UC Berkeley as an undergraduate student, right, or if you just live in the Bay Area and you're looking for research experience, pick a topic you're interested in, right? Let's say you're interested in neuroscience. Look up the neuroscience program at Harvard, sorry, neuroscience program at Berkeley. You're going to find here's a list of faculty members. Once you find the faculty members, every faculty member who has a lab, it'll say lab page, right? You can see their lab page, right? Go on their lab page, right? Read a little bit about the research that professor is doing, and then send them an email. Be like, hi, Professor So and so. My name is Ken. I'm an undergraduate student at UC Berkeley, and I'm looking to gain research experience. Um, I am interested in so and so topic. I saw on your website that you do research on so and so topic, and I find your research on so and so topic to be very interesting because of X, Y, and Z. Would you be willing to take on an additional volunteer in your lab? Right? Those are the kinds of emails that you're looking to send, right? Now, I'm not saying to write like a one-page essay because professors aren't going to read that, right? Like you're writing a short email, but you're also showing that you've spent some time looking at their website so you know what research that professor is doing. And you're going to have to send out a lot of those emails, right? Some students have to send out 100 to 150 emails until a professor says yes, right? So it really has it really doesn't matter if you're, a first generation college student, a non-traditional student. None of that matters at all, right? It's simply just taking the time to find labs, read about labs, and sending out a lot of emails until you get a professor a response.
Yeah, and the fall we always do a lot of programs on summer programs, and those are great because you get to do it full time and they pay you pretty well, and you can do really good projects, and then you also have your ability to network to do either if you go back to your own institution or anywhere else, and you could find that, and those are really great. And so, we've done a lot of sessions, uh, you know, and we also post quite many of them on social media.
Great. All right, next question. Does it affect your chances of getting into medical school if you double major? I know it'll take me longer, but I really want to double major. So I think we spent a good amount of time talking about this, but the thing is, a double major does not help your application, right? Um, and if you think about the opportunity cost, to be a double major means you're spending more time in classes, right? That means you're spending less time getting clinical research, volunteer, and leadership experience, right? So is that double major going to hurt your chances of getting to medical school? No, but does that double major help you get into medical school? It also does not, right? So in that case, I mean, you really want to think a little bit about why exactly it is you want a double major, right? Is it because you think a double major is cool, right? Or, like if there's something you're interested, right? Like let's say you're interested in music, sure, take some music classes. Do you need a double major? Because keep in mind, a double major just an extra line on your diploma, right? So I think a lot of people sort of like the idea of having a double major and extra major, but just realize in terms of your medical school application, a 4.0 single major is worth the same as a 4.0 double major. So in many cases, you're doing extra work for no additional benefit.
But you do you. But again, it doesn't improve or hurt your chances. But just know that there's all these extra things that you got to do to do it. Also, some universities charge you per unit, so that's also a big extra cost. So they call those. But if you really want to do it, like by all means, God bless.
Yeah. And not to say like I'm necessarily discouraging people because like Jubin said, I did I was a bioengineering and molecular cell biology simultaneous major, right? So I did it myself. I'm
And
not
I'm gonna say
necessarily.
something, and I'm gonna say something to embarrass Dr. Top, but he is smarter than the average guy. Um, like I said, I've known him for a long time, and he basically, if it takes me an hour to learn something, he does it in 10 minutes. So he's he's definitely he's academically prepared. He, how many AP classes did you have in high school? Like into like so he's there's a thing called the outlier, and Dr. Todd is the outlier. So if he's able to do it, great. But he's the outlier. He's not the standard.
Appreciate that, Jubin. The point I was trying to make was actually a separate one, which is there are some cases where a double major can be helpful to make you stand out, but that's only if there's a story you can build around it, right? For example, let's say you are someone who um, doubled majored in public health and um, in public health and Spanish, right? And you're Hispanic, right? And that is your focus, right? Like you grew up in a family where English was not the first language, right? You remember going to hospitals with your parents and having to translate uh, into Spanish for your parents when they had their health visits, right? In college, you join a health clinic for a Spanish speaking population. Right, like that's a situation where if you got a double major in Spanish, I think it fits very well into your application, right? Especially if it meets your career goals. If your goal is to focus on treating that target population, right? But I would say for a lot of, for most people who double major, they kind of just do it because they want to without a particularly good reason. All right. Next question. Will you ever feel ready to take the MCAT if you don't have 8 hours a day to study like other students? I guess to start, I don't know, who are these other students that have 8 hours a day to study, right? I would say most students are not studying 8 hours a day for the MCAT, right? Because most students are studying for the MCAT while they're a student, right? And unless you're a student with 8 hours a day, you know, that's not very common, right? And also, many students who graduate and are studying for the MCAT, they're studying for the MCAT while working part-time or full-time, right? So you certainly don't have to study 8 hours a day every single day, right? Like 8 hours a day, 7 days a week, that's 56 hours a week. Nobody's studying 56 hours a week for the MCAT unless you're in a very unique group of people, right? Um, I would say there's a lot of people where, on weekdays, they're often studying 2 to 3 hours a day, and maybe on weekends they're studying 4 to 6 hours a day, right? So don't feel like you need to be studying 8 hours a day to be successful on the MCAT, right? And um, when you're trying to look at time for the MCAT, it's not something you can directly calculate. I know people who've taken the MCAT 6, 7 times over 5 years, and they can't even break 500, which is the average score, right? I also have worked with students who studied for the MCAT in 3 weeks and got a 99th percentile MCAT score, right? So it's a little hard to talk about, like, I need to study this many hours to get this kind of target score, right? Every student is unique, but you certainly don't have to study 8 hours a day to be prepared for the exam. All right. Can working as an EMT benefit me in any way as a pre-med? Absolutely. Working as an EMT is a great experience, is a great way to get clinical experience. Absolutely.
It's an easy thing to do. A lot of community colleges offer it, and it's really cheap. The only thing is, I would say, if you're going to become an EMT and if you want to work as an EMT, the MDMCs are not very uh, school friendly. They want you to work 24 hours shifts, 12 hours shifts, and some of those shifts are really hard. But they're a great job for doing your postdoc or during the summer and those types of things. But it's a great skill. I mean, I've been in the MT for a long time, so and I work as them, so I'm biased. But
Great. How much does medical school cost on average? Ruben's writing a response, but that is highly variable depending on the school that you're looking to attend. Also depends on scholarships. There's quite a lot of factors that go into it. It's also not the focus of today's presentation. How many years will the MCAT be valid? Um, for most medical schools, the MCAT is valid for 3 years, right? Which means once you've taken the MCAT, it's valid for 3 years. So as long as you apply to medical school within 3 years, you'll be fine, right? So if you're looking at taking a single gap year, not a problem at all, right? For most schools, 3 years, which is plenty. There are two classes for physics, trig-based and calculus-based. Is there a preference for either for medical school? There's no preference for each, right? And there's pros and cons, right? What you're describing are really the two kinds of physics, which uh, the calculus-based one is usually physics for scientists and engineers, right? So if you're a physics major, if you're an engineering major, if you're a chemistry major, you often have to take calculus-based physics. The non-calculus based physics, the algebra based physics, that's often for life sciences majors, right? And like I said, I think there's pros and cons of each because the calculus based physics is definitely going to be harder. So it's going to be harder for you to get a good grade in that class. But also at the same time, you're probably going to learn the physics in more detail than algebra based physics, right? And learning the physics better in the calculus based physics class could make the MCAT easier when you're studying for the exam later. So if you take the algebra based physics, it's easier to get a higher grade, but it may not help you as much with the MCAT exam. But both are fine, really. Is there a time frame, not a standard, that you recommend studying for the MCAT? Every student is different. I would say most students study between 4 to 6 months for the MCAT. Some students will study for a shorter period, but those are students usually with a strong academic background. The longest I ever recommend a student to study for the MCAT is 1 year. All right, so I think that gives you a general sense, which is 4 to 6 months for most students. High achieving students can maybe do it in less. And the longest any student should think about studying for the MCAT is 1 year.
But
In medical
also,
schools,
but also,
go ahead.
the other things I would add too is again it goes down to just because somebody could do it at X amount of time doesn't mean you can. You may need longer. You may need shorter. If Dr. Powell takes them, you know, 10 hours to study for the MCAT, it may take me 10,000 hours. So it's just everybody's different, and you have to know that about yourself and what works for you than anything else.
Great. Do medical schools accept the MCAT after the application window opens? If so, is it a bad idea to take the MCAT in the summer you plan to apply? The answer is yes and yes. You can take the MCAT after you apply, but the thing is, when you submit your application, there's this box you have to check if you're going to retake the MCAT. And the thing is, if you check that you're going to retake the MCAT, they're going to let your application sit on the shelf until your new MCAT score arrives, in which case your application gets delayed. And it is very well established, and you'll probably hear this many times in various presentations at Pre-Med CC, that being a late applicant significantly reduces your chances of getting into medical school. So yes, that's a bad idea. Now, it's not to say you can't take the MCAT over the summer. A lot of students would take the MCAT over the summer, right? Take it in July, August, or September. It simply means you should plan on applying to medical school next summer.
Yeah, the other thing is medical school officers don't have a lot of staff, and that means that they have to update manually some of those applications, and so it just means that it will get missed.
Great. So, next, how would you recommend community college students manage longevity of extracurriculars if students are likely to transfer after 2 years and cannot continue extracurriculars they start at community college? That's a good question, right? I think it depends a little on what that activity is, because many activities can be continuous, right? If you start a club in your community college, start it again in the four-year institution, or if there's a chapter at community college, chapter in your community college, maybe there's also a chapter at your university, right? Or if it's something, if your community college is physically located at a different location than the four-year institution, maybe when you go back home on breaks, you continue, over winter break, right? So there's some ways to be able to continue with that longevity. But it's true, you can't do it for everything, right? But I'd also say that longevity doesn't necessarily have to be 4 years, right? So if you transfer to a four-year institution, if you join a research lab in your junior year and you continue it through your senior year, 2 years is still longevity, right? So it doesn't have to be 4 years.
The only thing that I would add is longevity is that for you to be good at something, you have to do it a lot. So if you're at a community college right now and saying, you know what, really not going to do anything because I'm only going to be here 2 years or 3 years or whatever, like getting those interpersonal skills and all of those things you must practice, and why not practice it somewhere that's smaller than somewhere bigger? What do they say? It's easier to be a big fish in a small pond than a small pond than a small fish in a big pond. So, those leadership experiences, any of those extracurriculars, like do it. I mean, obviously, you know, do it, or if it's not there, make it happen.
Yes. And unfortunately, we are at time for today, and I've got to run. But remember, I am speaking again. Third session is tomorrow morning. So if you're free, you want to join, you want to ask more questions, be happy to answer more questions tomorrow.